name is Ilyana Kuzhenko. I am a professor in the economics department. I'm also a co-director of the Griswold Center for Economic Policy Studies. And this is the Griswold Center's annual tradition of the Junior Paper Research Forum. So the point of this gathering is twofold. One, it's to recognize outstanding work on policy-related topics from the past year of juniors. So it's a chance to give them some credit for having done excellent work the previous year, and perhaps more important, it's a chance to introduce current juniors to the junior paper program. So you're going to see examples of truly excellent work, but we don't want this to be intimidating. These are just going to give you some broad sense of what you could write your junior paper about. One of the best things about economics, as many of you might have already picked up, is how broad it is, that you can basically do almost any question you want so long as you approach it with the tools of economics. I will also take this moment to give you guys some advice. For many years, I directed a group of junior papers, and my main piece of advice is to work as hard as possible in the fall. The fall is actually where the hardest work is done. If you accomplish everything that is on the everything that's on the schedule to be turned in by the time of the prospectus, the spring and the paper kind of writes itself. If you are not in that position by the end of the fall, the paper is not going to write itself. So I just, every student that came back to me in the many years that I taught JP said, oh, that was the best advice, that just work really hard in the fall, and then the spring you could turn it in early. Because but you can't do it all in the last week. So that would be my advice, is to really keep yourself on a tight schedule in the fall. And just also, I think you should appreciate what a special opportunity this is. So Princeton is one of these places that really puts an emphasis on writing. And basically here, you're going to get much more hand-holding than you would get in a normal place. It's sort of a warm-up to write your senior thesis. You're going to have not just professors, but also graduate students who are there to help you step by step come up with a piece of original research. Most universities don't offer this opportunity, and so I really hope that you're able to take full advantage of it. So with that, we are now going to move on to our actual papers. I am going to introduce the students in the order. I'll just start with the first student, and then I'll introduce the students as they come up. So our first student presenter is Peter Anella. Peter's research looks at the long-term impact of the minimum wage on teenager self-employment trajectories, and Peter's advisor was Professor Can Ergun. Make sure you join your clickers. Join on your clickers. All right.
All right. Hey, everybody. I know y'all are very excited to be here. I remember last year I was sitting in this same room listening to this, and at the end of it, I turned to my buddy and I said, "Did you understand anything they just said?" He said no, and I was like, "All right, we're screwed." But don't worry, you're not, because I was in the same position, and I never thought in a million years I'd be behind here talking to you guys. But, it happens. That's crazy. That's how the world works. So first, this is it, the question mark. What are we doing here? What's going on? I don't really know. You don't know. You don't know what you're doing. You think you're about to climb Mount Everest. But there is a large learning curve. I didn't know what I was doing at all. Like I said, didn't understand any of these equations you're about to see here, but you will make it. You will do fine. Everybody starts where you guys start, and everybody submits a junior paper, so it can be done and will be done. Let's see. Oh, and then one thing I really did not know is how the heck to come up with a question. I was like, I don't even know where to start. I would say that if you have like a personal experience, like how I came up with mine, I'll just tell a story. So I had this relationship in high school, and let's just say she enjoyed the finer things in life, and I was running out of money, and I'm from Alabama, and so the minimum wage in Alabama is $7 an hour. And so I was like, well, we went out to dinner. The dinner was like $80, and I was like, you're kidding me. I got to work 12 hours, to buy a dinner. So I said, this is not going to work. I don't know. So I always thought about that in the back of my mind. So that's kind of what pushed me to write about. No, so then I was like, what am I going to do? I need some money. So I started like a car detailing business, and that made pretty good money. But what made me start that was the terrible minimum wage. So that kind of made me think about, that's what kind of got me going. If you don't really know at all where to start and you're not interested in anything, which is totally understandable, I would definitely talk. You get an advisor, which is a professor, and then you get a PhD student. They are specialized in some topic. If you have no clue, maybe start reading about what's in their topic. And you're going to have to read a lot. Unfortunately, you're going to have to read a lot of these papers, but you guys can do it. So let's just start. I did the slideshow similar to how like my JP was organized, like the different sections. So just to kind of give you a synopsis of how you'll do it. So introduction, why, like here's my questions. My question was to measure the effect of living in a high minimum wage state on teenagers' long-term probability of being self-employed. So if growing up in a low minimum wage state like me, does that make you more likely to be self-employed? Who knows? So who cares about this? Maybe not y'all, but people do care. People who want to be self-employed, like, a ton of people really enjoy the idea of self-employment, but yet there's not many studies done about it. The government enjoys this topic because, they're making minimum wages and they're coming up with these policies. So they appreciate studies about this. And, like I said, it is understudied. Not many people, there's not many papers on this. And as you'll see in the lit review, this is basically when you just look at all the research that's been done around your topic and you kind of figure out, oh, here's a whole puzzle, but it's missing this piece, which I, so generously spent a whole year creating to fill. So like what I said, teen employment and minimum wage. There's some papers on that. How does minimum wage affect teen employment? We don't know. Some say, oh, it increases teen employment. It decreases teen employment. It has no effect. I don't know. Self-employment, same deal. A lot of papers are like, oh, increasing the minimum wage decreases long-term self-employment, increases long-term self-employment. Like I said, no consensus in this data, and there's really not much data on self-employment. So here's kind of how the data I got, which is pretty much the most important part of your entire paper is the data. If you have a question that you like but you don't have data, it is not easy to make data. I mean, some of you guys are really ambitious, go for it, but it's really not easy. If you want to clean data, oh man, that is not fun either. I'm just saying you should really find data that is easy to work with because that will make your life tremendously easier, and you will not be stressing with writing 1,300 lines of code and being a week before it's done in Oscar's office asking him how to do everything. So I encourage you to find good data. My data had a bunch of data of minimum wages, like what each state minimum wage was throughout from 1970s on to now. And then IPUM, which is basically like the census every 10 years, but they also do it every single year, and it gives like data about like birthplace and self-employment status, which is really what I used, and age. And so here's a graph. This took, you might be like, oh, this is a boring graph. This took me like a whole day in Stata to make this graph, but it's Princeton colors. So this pretty much shows that, the federal minimum wage is going up, and the number of states with a higher minimum wage than the federal is also increasing. So this is relevant. More states are having a minimum wage over the federal line, and so this is a pertinent paper to what's good, the trends in real stuff. So this one, write this down. No, I'm just kidding. Don't write this down. But basically, you will come up with this equation in your paper. This is basically like the model that you use to run your regression. You don't have to worry about this. I'm just putting it out here that you do. You have an independent variable, you have a dependent variable, which, I was changing the minimum wage, whether it was above or below, and then I was looking how that affected self-employment, which is on the far left. But basically, this will go into Stata, but this does not actually go into Stata. I was really confused about that. This is just so people understand what you're doing. My Stata looked like that, so it's really like nothing. This does not relate at all, okay? So this is one thing that people read, and then this is just you do this on your own and no one ever sees this file again. But I didn't really know that. All right, so I ran this regression, and then what were my results? I don't know how many know. I probably didn't know how to read this table a year ago, but whatever. You don't really need to know this. Basically, it just says on the left side, self-employment decreased when the state was above the federal minimum wage. On the right side, instead of saying 0 to 1, if the state was above the federal minimum wage, I said how many percent, like what percent above the federal minimum wage is a state. And so that gave me a more detailed answer. So these are just things you got to think about. I started with doing a binary variable, and then I was like, oh, I can probably make this a little bit better, more granular if I do percent above, and it actually gave better results. So moral of the story is, make sure that you're always pushing the boundaries and thinking, how could I make this better? So these are results in English. A high minimum wage made self-employment lower, and a low minimum wage made the probability of being self-employed later in life higher. So that's what we did. And so here's the things to think about. So when you do your regression, you have your question, blah, 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 you really got to know, is my regression good? Does this data, is it defendable? All this stuff. So in mine, people were moving all over the place. I used birthplace as an indicator of where they were when they were age of 18, which is what I use. But sometimes birthplace doesn't correlate. People can move. So I'm just saying, when you come up with your paper, to make it good, if you want to make it good, which you should, you have to think about, why is it defendable? If you were interrogating yourself about critiquing your paper, what critiques would you have? And you need to address these in your paper. And so that's something also just to consider when you're moving forward. And then, so before we get to another beautiful white table from Stata, talking about pushing the envelope. Really, this is what takes, I would say, a good paper to a great paper is trying to understand what are the weaknesses of my paper and how can I, defend those. And then also, why did I get the results? So, why does a high minimum wage decrease the probability of self-employment? So I did ask myself, I said, why does that happen? And so I was like, maybe education is the reason. So I did some regressions about that. Basically, I just put some more code in Stata, and I found out that, when there is a, basically, this doesn't really matter. We can just go here. Why does this happen? So when there's a high minimum wage, more people graduate high school, which makes sense because these minimum wage employers are usually, they only want high school grads. So it gives people an incentive to graduate high school. College, on the other hand, if I can earn $20 an hour over here, and I'm debating whether to go to college, it's like my return on investment for going to college is not that great because I can go straight into this job that earns a good amount of money. And so that is kind of why this is like the whole entree of my whole paper is the reasoning is when you have a high minimum wage, it decreases people graduating college, and that in turn down the line decreases the probability of being self-employed and more people starting business and stuff because there's a lot of people that start businesses are college grads. And so that was kind of the main coup de grace of my paper and why I think it did pretty well because this is something that people don't think about in policy. And this gives, I guess, policymakers another. I don't really know if they're going to read this, probably not. But it could be that they think about this down the line. So that is my paper. Like I said, if you want to take a paper from good to great, you have to really ask yourself, why does this happen? Why is it defendable? All this stuff. And my end notes are: don't stress. Everybody does this. You can do this. And talk with your advisor. I was meeting with the PhD student weekly, because that also kind of keeps you on track. I would definitely put whoever's more available. For me with my PhD student, I kept always doing Calendly, signing up, just kind of staying on track, and he helped me a ton. Yeah, that's it. And I'll be signing copies for $5 after the event if anybody's interested in that as well. But thank you guys so much for your time, and I hope you got something.
$5, that's a bargain at twice the price. Our next speaker is Amelia Feiner. Amelia's research explores abortion access and female labor force participation in the wake of Texas House Bill 2.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here today, even though you didn't have a choice. While Peter just gave a great example of a paper that showed something really interesting, I'm going to talk a little bit today about what happens when the results from your JP really don't make a lot of sense, which will probably happen to a lot of you guys. When you run regressions with data, things go wrong and get really messy, and sometimes it can be really hard to make sense of why things are showing up the way they are. And so that was kind of the story of my JP. So like many of you, I really did not know what I wanted to write about. And to those of you guys feeling super stressed right now, I actually think picking your topic is like without a doubt the hardest part of writing a JP. Once you even decide on like a subdomain, everything gets a lot easier. But I really didn't know what to pick, and I didn't have a lot of pressing economic questions that I had to answer or responded to in my life. I kind of read the news and was interested generally in what's going on, but it's really hard to write a JP about things that are happening that you're interested in just because there's not a lot of data. So I got a really good piece of advice, which was to look at what's going on that you think is interesting, and then look about 10 years in the past, maybe 15, 20 years, and see if there's anything historical that can tell you about what's happening now. Because I didn't really care about what happened 20, 30 years ago as much as I care about what's happening now and what's going to happen in the future. So anything I could kind of learn causally from historical episodes I thought would be interesting. So I was kind of inspired by the Supreme Court's ruling at the end of my freshman year in Dobbs versus Jackson, and kind of the change in abortion access that I saw rolling out all over the country. But obviously it was too soon to study any of that. So I decided maybe I would kind of go through the historical record and look for heterogeneity in abortion access. And I found that pretty much all of the papers that were studying abortion access in the US were in the post-Roe rollout in the 1970s. And I just thought that that was such a limitation because so much has changed about the way women work since then. And so I was kind of parsing through the literature about contraceptive access and female labor force participation when I stumbled onto this policy that I'd never heard of before that occurred in Texas in 2013. And that was kind of where my whole JP took off from. So that probably happened in about November. So you guys have a lot of time before you start kind of really honing in on one place. So the policy I focused on was called Texas House Bill 2, and it was a law that exogenously closed more than half of the abortion facilities in Texas. And so this closure had to do with kind of things that were unrelated to where the facilities were located. So I was able to use it as an exogenous change, and that's something you're going to hear a lot throughout your process with your JP advisor. They're going to yell at you all the time about why things actually don't cause things and how you have to make sure you're really looking at heterogeneous treatment, because the real goal of a JP is to show that something causes something, which is harder to do than I at least initially realized. And it doesn't just have to do with exogeneity. It also, as Peter was talking about, has a lot to do with causal mechanisms. So throughout your JP, I kind of think if you keep those two things in mind, no matter what the outcomes of your regressions are, you're going to write a really strong paper. So first, some policy or change needs to be exogenous. And second, you should think really rigorously about the causation. So for me, obviously to most of us, it seems clear that if you can't get an abortion and have less control over your fertility, you'll work less. But actually, you do need to dig a little bit deeper into why that is. And you can do that by doing a really good lit review. So this is a tree from one of the papers I was reading for my lit review, but it kind of shows how all the factors move through access to healthcare, fertility, educational attainment, and also then kind of the proximate reality that women face of choosing whether to give care to a child or go to work. But things are a little bit more nuanced than that. So given the policy and kind of those causal mechanisms that I just discussed, I had a hypothesis that's stated there above. I won't read it out to you guys, but the hypothesis made sense. So I thought, so I started looking for data, and like Peter, I really didn't want to have to make my own data. That sounded really hard. And for my dependent variables, that was pretty much the case. I was able to source everything from the census, and that is CPS, and like IPUMS is something I would really, really recommend using. It's really good data. But what I didn't have data for was the independent variable, and that was where Oscar came in. So I had qualitative data about abortion clinic closures that were listed out. So I knew the dates that each of them closed, but I had to translate those dates into kind of a spatial model for how the distance that women had to travel to get an abortion changed. So using this module that Oscar helped me download into Stata, we went through it. And what I would say is that is something I would never have been able to do on my own. And so if there is something that sounds really hard that you can't do yourself, you have so many resources to go help you with. So I would recommend doing that. So I also had the issue that I had no full access to individual level data, so I was stuck at the county level, which I felt pretty good about. County level seemed fine to me, so I decided that I was just gonna run my regressions and kind of look through my data, which I did, and I saw these big changes, and I felt really excited about it. So I went through and ran my regressions, and again, using a model that you guys don't need to know about. And I found the following, which was that there was this huge decrease in the abortion rate for my most severe treatment group, but I didn't really see anything in the female labor force participation or in full-time. But then in my second most severe treatment group, I saw this change in the female labor force participation rate, specifically in my full-time statistic, which I wanted to capture like more nuanced changes in how women worked. And so I was a little flustered because I was like, okay, this is the data I had. This is what I showed. It doesn't really show anything. What am I supposed to do? And this is where my advisor said, okay, you kind of have a choice now. You can just leave it and write about maybe why that happened, or you can start to dig a little bit deeper into the causal mechanisms and think about why they happened and try to look at subgroups. So about a month before my JP was due, I decided to kind of do a JP within my JP about the causal mechanisms using individual level data. So it was a similar experiment. I could only represent 38 of the counties, but again, I ran my differences and differences model, and I was able to control for all these things that I wasn't able to see before. So these were my results. Again, I saw kind of no increase in fertility, which was strange, but I kind of just ignored that for now. And I did actually see real impacts on female labor force participation and hours worked per week. So I think that one of the lessons I learned in my JP is like when you can get individual level data or any sort of disaggregated data, always use that over aggregated data. It'll make the questions you can ask and answer so much more interesting, and also will help you kind of be able to keep working and not hit a wall. When you have an individual level data set, you can kind of run regressions on it for infinity. So I was able to dig into subgroups. I looked at race, and I found actually that for Black women, there was an increase in fertility, although this still wasn't kind of corresponded to by any effect on wage or hours worked. And then for young women, so women under the age of 22, I did see this increase in fertility accompanied by a decrease in income. So that was really the only group where I saw those two things go together. So this is kind of my takeaway from my JP. Do not shy away from things that don't make sense. Even though throughout my paper, like changes in female labor outcomes were not always accompanied by corresponding effects on fertility, and that was kind of the heart of my causal mechanism, I thought that it actually gave me a lot of room to think about why I might be seeing that, even if I couldn't even address it quantitatively. So as long as I think you spend a lot of time in your discussion and your lit review kind of wrestling with these ideas, it really doesn't matter if you answer anything fully or not. What they want to see is you're thinking through everything really rigorously and kind of doing the best you can to dig your teeth into a problem. So yeah, good luck, everyone.
I just wanted to highlight something that Amelia said, which is you are not graded on whether your hypothesis turns out to be true or whether your hypothesis turns out to be, the results aren't significant, so I don't know if it's true or not. You are graded on, did you have a well-stated question? Did you gather the data that's appropriate to answer the question? Did you design a regression that's appropriate to answer the question? And then, as Amelia said, can you describe your results in a clear and accurate way, even if those results are not what you thought they were? So I know there's a lot of stress at the end of the year. Oh, my results aren't significant. Like, you should not worry. As long as you describe those results accurately and clearly and give some sense of their limitations, just as Amelia said, don't shy away from inconsistencies, like, you'll receive full credit. I mean, your paper didn't fully, confirm your hypothesis and you won a junior paper prize. So That is just not your job. That is not part of the grade, and I just want to, I can't emphasize that enough. Okay, our next speaker is Sofie Grouws. Sofie's research examines agricultural subsidies and the decline of rural America. And Sofie's advisor was Ernest Liu.
All right. Can you hear me? All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here, even though you have to be here. I am super excited to present my JP to you today. I looked at the relationship between agricultural subsidies and economic health in rural America, and I was advised by Ernest Liu. So I'm going to start with just a really brief overview of kind of the full picture of my research project. So my kind of driving question was, what is the impact of increased exposure to USDA commodity subsidies on rural economic health? And so to explore this question, I was able to utilize quasi-random variation in the county-level composition of agricultural products in the U.S., and then using a series of two-stage least squares regressions with something called a shift-share instrument, I was able to isolate a causal effect. And so my findings suggest that commodity subsidies actually cause a wide array of decline in rural economic outcomes. All right, so why am I talking about rural America? I was looking for my topic. I didn't really know what I was interested, what I wanted to do. And I was reading the New York Times one day, and there is a column by Paul Krugman where he says, "White rural rage is arguably the single greatest threat to American democracy." And now I'm from small town Iowa, and so I thought this was really interesting. I wanted to get into that idea and think about where this rural rage is coming from. And so I did some looking, and there's a line of work by Case and Deaton that kind of links this idea of rural rage and despair to recent rural economic decline in the US. And so I wanted to kind of dig in deeper and figure out why is rural America in this economic decline and what might be done about it. So then I kind of looked to agricultural subsidies as something that is, supposed to help the rural economy broadly. They're styled as kind of insulating the whole rural economy from risk. And there's this really common political belief in rural America and also among politicians that a strong agricultural sector and support of the agricultural sector is equivalent to supporting rural welfare overall. But the data kind of contradicts this. We've seen a strong divergence between the fate of farms and the rural economy generally. And so I wanted to investigate for my junior paper what the relationship between agricultural subsidies and the rural economy really is. And that's where my literature contribution lies. So this paper tried to establish a direct causal relationship between these subsidy payments and rural economic health. And so it's kind of confusing, I think, initially to understand how putting billions of dollars into rural economies is actually ending up hurting these economies. And so I spent a lot of my time thinking about why this might be, so thinking about my mechanism for how this effect is happening. And this is kind of what I came to. So these USDA agricultural subsidies theoretically help rural communities, but they have a really problematic incentive structure. The way that the subsidies are designed ends up providing a comparative advantage to large farms over small and medium-sized farms, which ends up with market risk insulation increasing with farm size. So smaller farms are more vulnerable. And this generates a misallocation of capital between these farms. Overall, this leads to a primary negative effect on proprietorship and employment in agriculture, which then ends up having a secondary negative effect on proprietorship and employment in the service sector. Overall, this leads to population declines, unemployment, and income loss in rural areas. And so this is my mechanism, this is my theory, and then I needed to find kind of the data to test it. So I'm going to give you a little bit of information about commodity subsidy program because, at least personally, it was not something I knew anything about before getting into this, but now I know a ton about it. So the commodity subsidy program in the US has been around in some form since 1933. It started out as payments to farmers for burning or idling land, so paying people to not farm. And since 1933, it's kind of become less supportive and less supportive until 2002, when there was a big change and we instated a lot of new supports for farmers. And so these take the form of both direct payments, which are direct payments to farmers based on their farm's historical revenue, and countercyclical payments, which are inversely tied to the market price of the crop that they farm. And so these payments to farms are based on farm acreage and crop type. only specific crops qualify, amounting to around 50% of total agricultural production in the US. And I just want to emphasize kind of the scale of this program. Between the period I studied, so 2002 to 2023, $126 billion worth of these subsidies went into rural communities. So that's a lot of money to be spending if it's not working. And then the Farm Bill is the policy that governs all of agricultural policy in the US, particularly these commodity subsidies. And that bill is rewritten around every 5 years. And it changes the mandatory subsidy outlays for the next 5 years. So every 5 years, they write a new bill. They're not really paying attention to what's going on in agriculture. It's just kind of like a political battle. And they end up with a different mandatory subsidy outlay for the next 5 years. That's somewhat random. And so this is kind of like a scary data table, but don't worry about it. You don't need it. You'll figure out how to do it. But my main data source was these FSA payments. So one of the great things about agriculture, even if you're not interested in agriculture, there's really good data on agriculture. So I was able to get individual level payments. I was able to get like down to the name and address of who was getting these payments for years. And then I narrowed my data set to just non-metropolitan counties that had some sort of significant agricultural sector. Similarly to the other people, I pulled a lot of my outcomes of interest from the American Community Survey data, from the census, and I also used the Bureau of Labor Statistics and also the National Agricultural Statistics Service. And I ended up with a final sample size of over 1,000 counties for 11 years. And so, as Amelia said, like the kind of goal is to find a causal relationship, but I had this issue of the endogeneity of the subsidy flow. So it's really plausible that counties that are getting a lot of subsidy payments are doing bad for other reasons. You can think of a lot of other reasons why counties with large agricultural sectors might be doing badly economically. And so I couldn't just use the subsidy flow to establish a causal relationship. And so I did a lot of research into different methods, and I found something called a shift-share instrument, which is basically a constructed instrument that you can use to kind of utilize quasi-random variation to construct an exogenous instrument when there's not a fully exogenous instrument on its own. And so my share was that percent of eligible agricultural value in a county. So as I said, like only 50% of crops farmed in the US are eligible for these subsidies, and that kind of varies randomly by county. And so that measure, that percent of eligible agricultural value, kind of measures the exposure of each county to these agricultural subsidies. And then there's this exogenous shift, the change in the total mandatory commodity spending every 5 years when the Farm Bill is rewritten. So this acts as a common exogenous shock that's constant across counties. So the idea is that this share determines a differential exposure of each county to this common exogenous shock. And so through this, I was able to isolate a real causal effect despite this issue of endogenous subsidy flows. These are kind of like my main results. Just broadly, I found that subsidy exposure was linked to broad measures of rural economic decline. I found that increased subsidy exposure, so not actually using the amount of subsidies they got, but just predicted subsidies based on what percent of their agriculture was eligible for these commodity subsidies. It predicted declines in population growth, employment growth, and median household income growth year on year. This is just one of my tables from my paper, but just to like demonstrate kind of what these tables look like. You can see that there was, for counties receiving kind of like the median exposure, it predicts a population growth decline of 1.858% annually, which suggests that this could be a really major source of rural population collapse. I also tested like a battery of additional and intermediate outcomes to kind of get a more full picture of rural well-being, and also to kind of test that the intermediate steps in my mechanism were making sense. And this is kind of the meat of the paper. This is, I think, what's really important, is the policy implications. And it's just kind of like aid to farmers is not a great way to encourage rural development. And it really suggests that there needs to be a restructuring of the way that the USDA is doing its spending. So they need to truly prioritize rural development through actual programs focused on helping the rural economy, and also restructure these farm support programs to reduce the harm they do unintentionally while keeping that goal of like helping farmers alive. So my advice, I guess, to you guys is take the time to find something you care about. I found it so much easier to work on this paper because there was a point at which I actually got excited about doing it because I was excited about the results that I was getting, and about what those results could mean for the world, which is cool. Like, it's cool to know that like you can do something that you can kind of find something that really matters. And even if you don't, it keeps you motivated to like keep looking for an answer. And I guess kind of for me, I actually changed my topic 2 weeks before the prospectus was due. I wouldn't recommend, but I also think that it's like kind of a sign to like bet on yourself a little bit. It's like if you don't feel like something is right with your first topic, you don't have to stick with it just because like it's what you started with, you're locked in, you already did your outline. Like if you feel like a change is going to help you and make you more excited, just go for it, because it's so much easier to work on the project if you feel good about it. So yeah, thank you for listening.
Thank you, Sophie. Our next speaker is Elise Kait. Elise's research investigates the impact of risk tolerance and gender on entrepreneurial activity.
Hi everyone, I can tell you're probably all a bit bored at this point. I know we tend to reduce ourselves to our screens, so hopefully I'll keep it short and sweet and you won't be too bored. First, I want to talk about sort of my motivation for talking about risk tolerance and entrepreneurship. I think, like people have mentioned before me, finding your topic is the hardest part. I'm running into that again for my thesis, but the reason I wanted to research this is I've been very involved with the entrepreneurial community at Princeton. In my time here, I am in Prospect Student Ventures, the first venture capital club at Princeton. If you have a startup, please apply. The deadline is soon. You can get up to $10,000. Back to the paper. I've been very interested in entrepreneurship. It's sort of my primary interest, and that allowed me to sort of narrow down my topic. And then from there, I sort of, talked to friends in my eating club. I talked to my parents and kind of iterated on ideas, and then at some point started looking at papers and continued on. The way I got to risk tolerance was this picture on the screen on the right up there. I think it's kind of a fun-looking thing, but it was sort of a model created by two researchers, Markman and Barron. And it's essentially trying to figure out how a person fits into the role of entrepreneur. And within the circle in the cone are sort of different features of being an entrepreneur. And I wanted to add something to this. I wanted to kind of figure out what else there was in this explanation for why someone would be an entrepreneur. And so I came up with risk tolerance because, as you may know, entrepreneurship is a very risky endeavor. You're making that your job. If it doesn't go well, you're not going to make any money. You might owe people money. That's risky. And just to quickly go back to entrepreneurship, it's an interesting thing to look at. The rates are increasing dramatically. It's probably more than 20% at this point with all the new AI companies. And entrepreneurship is a driver of economic growth, innovation. If you think about the iPhone coming out allowed app producers to make apps, make money. That's more jobs. It's important. And then moving on to why I looked at gender. So around 2% historically of venture capital and angel funding has gone to female entrepreneurs. So there's a lot more barriers to entry for female founders. It's more risky for them. So moving on, actually, I'll go to my research questions first. So sort of my primary questions of interest are people who have high risk tolerance more likely to be entrepreneurs. My hypothesis was yes, that would make sense since it's a risky endeavor. And then looking at the difference of that impact for men versus women, I thought the effect would be higher for having high risk tolerance. The effect would be stronger for women because it's a more risky endeavor. And very quickly on my data, I used the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth. If you're interested in writing a behavioral paper that has personality traits, I really recommend that you look at this data set. There's one from 1979 that surveys participants till now, and then there's one, I believe, from 1997 that surveys people until now. And so there's 2 data sets. They have slightly different questions. There's lots of personality questions. There's tons of questions in general. It's like a fantastic data source. So I would say look at that. And then entrepreneurship was measured, either you're an entrepreneur or you're not. And risk tolerance was a self-reported scale. And this actually is an interesting point. There were papers that I looked at that used the same data set that I used. They were also looking at risk tolerance and entrepreneurship, but they used a different measurement for risk tolerance. So the point I'm trying to make is it's okay to have a paper that is similar to other research papers that have been done. That's likely something that you'll run into, is someone has had the same idea as you. But there's ways that you can differentiate your paper and make it new, find a new sort of interesting conclusion. And mine was that the risk measurement was self-reported instead of a classic, like, would you rather have the sure thing or some risk where you might lose whatever or gain some other thing. And this is a very scary picture. I never like when I'm shown things like this. But the reason I have this here is to show that the model I used, my methodology, was a logistic regression, which allows me to predict the likelihood that someone is an entrepreneur. The other point is I had these covariates. Most of them are personality traits, and a few more are just basic, what's your family's income, education, what's your race, kind of basic things in the model. And third point is I broke it down between, so I did one regression for everyone, one for men, one for women. Another one of these crazy pictures. The point of this is to show that my first hypothesis was correct, that the higher your risk tolerance is, the more likely you are to be an entrepreneur. That's the middle column in the risk row. It's very significant. It's positively correlated. So I was very happy to find that out. And in the picture on the right, this is an interesting way that you can show your results instead of just one of these big coefficient tables. So I broke it down into people's percentiles of risk tolerance. So moving from the 10th to the 95th percentile, and getting the predicted probability that you are an entrepreneur based on the percentile that you fall into. And I actually found that it's about you're 4 times more likely to be an entrepreneur if you are in the 95th percentile of risk tolerance than someone in the 10th percentile. So that's a pretty big increase. And if you're in the 95th percentile, you have a 30% chance of being an entrepreneur, which is pretty high in my opinion. I mean, I wouldn't have come up with that on my own. And this is very similar structure as the previous page. Now, if you recall, my second hypothesis was that the effect for risk tolerance on women would be higher than for men because it's more risky for women. This is actually not what I found, which is interesting. So you can see that for men, the coefficient was 0.2. For women, it was 0.18. And I'll get into that in a second. And then you can again see the percentiles. For men, it's about 4 times as likely again. For women, you're about 3 times more likely as you move from 10th to 95th percentile. Now, my explanation for why this is one, that since it's a self-reported scale of your risk tolerance, women might be more likely to report themselves lower, just their own, because it's a very subjective measurement. You might, like, my 5 might be someone else's 7, right? Or my 7 might be someone else's 5, either way. So it's a very subjective measure. It's a proxy. You know, you can never really tell someone's true risk tolerance, and there's various types. And another explanation is that women start different types of companies, different types of startups. So the entrepreneurship measurement accounted for not only tech startups, what you generally think of as a startup, but also like restaurants or new businesses would be considered an entrepreneurial endeavor. So they might have had, businesses they started that had much less risk than the businesses men started. And and I talked about the limitation on the bottom, which is the subjectivity issue. Another issue I ran into was reverse causality, and your advisor will likely talk to you about this at some point. It's a very big problem. Because the nature of my data was that the risk tolerance measurement was taken around or after people started companies, you could argue that starting a company that is risky made me more tolerant to risks rather than I was tolerant to risks, therefore I started a company. And there's some debate about this. I had some research that I found that went against that idea. I won't bore you with it. If you want to know, you can ask me. But definitely be mindful of reverse causality. Your advisor would definitely likely bring this up to you. And just to finish off, I think these are some interesting ideas that sort of sparked for me when I was going back through my paper. These might be interesting questions for you to think about when you start your paper if you're interested in entrepreneurship, risk, behavioral questions. Yeah, thank you.
And I believe our final speaker is Xabier Sardina. Xabier's research examines the effect of AI, emotional intelligence exposure, in the online HR process. Human resources, HR? Yeah. Okay, making sure. All right. And Xabier's advisor was Swati Bhatt.
All right. We are almost there. Thanks for being here. My name is Xabier, or Xavier in the American. It's a Spanish name, so. First, I want to thank my advisor. I don't know if she's here, but Professor Bhatt for her incredible support throughout this whole process. And in fact, we're going to keep working together for my senior thesis, so very excited for that. So the title of my study was The Effect of AI Emotional Intelligence Exposure on HR Job Candidates During an Online IQ-Based Examination. I know, a very short title. So a little introduction. I'm personally very into kind of the intersection of psychology and AI systems. And while I was doing some research, I found like surveillance complaints were definitely like a consistent trend that was coming up. Specifically in November of 2019, Epic filed an FTC complaint against HireVue for, quote, unproven emotional AI systems, which I'm sure you've all heard of, if not used HireVue. It's like, you record your responses for kind of like an outbound job application. And so essentially they had this proprietary AI model that would run in the background and pick up on your facial expressions, your word usage, your intonation, and would kind of create this output, including, quote, personal stability and willingness to learn. And this would be like rated. And so this would like play a factor in if you ultimately got the job, like the end HR team would get this output. So, very surprising to most people when they found this out. Obviously, I've used HireVue. I never knew of this. Again, HireVue is a very influential, business, tens of millions of video interviews, hundreds of millions of chat-based engagements. And actually, ultimately, they conceded to this complaint. So they claim to have stopped using this model. On the AI side, to no one's surprise, obviously the AI industry is ever growing, but specifically AI HR is also very significant, a very significant portion of that overall cap. The market cap of that being about 20 billion by 27 and has a yearly CAGR of 35%, which is very strong. In 23, there was an AI safety summit in the UK where they ultimately agreed to declare, to focus on AI safety and implementing guardrails. And since then, a lot of policies have been pushed around just, really controlling how we develop these systems. The most notable of which recently being a California bill called SB 1047, called, quote, Safe and Secure Innovation for Frontier AI Models Act. And what's really interesting about this is the leading AI companies, to no one's surprise, are against it. So like OpenAI, Anthropic, all these businesses, but their employees have pushed this policy up until the last stage. So there's a very interesting divide between like AI employees and AI executives who arguably have very different interests. They have a lot more to gain if the business, becomes, $10 billion business, et cetera. So I read some additional studies and found some interesting things as well. Specifically, Romic in 23 raises the question of emotional models being proprietary or open source, which is very relevant to the HireVue case because, HireVue is a private company for profit. Their model is proprietary, so there's definitely kind of like a conflict of interest with, between these two different types of models. Sunderling in 22 argues that discrimination is a main risk of AI. It's very, very difficult to address model flaws. And this raises a very, pertinent, important point about AI models. There's very much kind of like a black box effect. Like we know the data that we're feeding to these models, we know that kind of the architectural infrastructure in place, but there's like a very weird jump between a model that's just not too impressive. You add a few parameters and suddenly it's like the next GPT release. So there's still a lot we don't know about these models. And finally, Nashad Nawaz in 22 found that emotional intelligence models by leading companies like Microsoft, IBM, had very high rates of mistakes when dealing with dark-skinned individuals, which raises yet another issue in terms of, is this software applicable to all people, and in what scenarios, and depending on your skin tone, you might get a different result, you might not get the job, et cetera. So very important trends to consider. And ultimately, with all of this, I landed on another very short research question, which generally just asks, like, how knowing that you're being analyzed, how does that affect your performance on like an online-based examination? And for the purpose of this, for my JP, I decided to try to simulate like an HR, like IQ-based exam to try to like, to have that tie back to HireVue, given that's the exact service they provide. And so I ultimately decided to conduct an experiment just because, frankly, I thought that would be the most fun. So, experiment design. So I anonymously onboarded 50 Princeton undergrads through the help of the Princeton Survey Research Center. I randomly assigned groups to the treatment and the control. Treatment group is group 1. They're exposed to AI during the first half of their 50-question exam, so the first 25 questions, and they're informed that they're going to be exposed. The treatment group, or the control group, group 2, is not exposed at any point. Participants were also paid to try to incentivize, the utmost effort, and the model I used was Emotion AI from Morphcast. Also, I will preface by saying I had to go through IRB approval. That's a thing to do, and if you are considering running your own experiment, definitely like start that very early because there's a lot of back and forth that took place. So, a graph to try to make it even more clear between the two groups and the experiment design. So again, on the left, the treatment group had their facial expressions recorded for the first 25, no analysis for the second 25. Group 2, no analysis at any point. Every other aspect of the experiment is consistent, same exact questions, same like 12-second timeout allocated for each question. They also had a buffer just to kind of serve as like a reset, especially if you're in the treatment group. And again, they both had the same buffer questions. And then here is just a little taste of the types of questions that were asked. I essentially grouped them into 3 main categories, so like standardized math, analytical reasoning, and basic world knowledge. And then on the surveillance side, again, the surveillance is, I tried to make it very obvious to really like push it onto the treatment that they're being recorded. And again, the control group, did not have any of these, wasn't exposed to AI, so they didn't have these visual cues. So if you're in the treatment, when you log on to the site to start the exam, you're asked to share your camera. And then once you start, you can see these like red cues like AI recording just to really remind you. So my hypothesis was that I expected group 2 or the control to perform a lot better just because I generally believe, like high stakes situations, if you're being like analyzed or scrutinized, you're just going to be more nervous. So that was kind of like my general belief. Methodology, I used both the test score data and the Morphcast output. Test score data was what I ran the regressions on. Morphcast is more supplementary. And I use this data package that estimates like linear regressions with multiple potential fixed effects. And this regression also accounted for like unobserved variables like gender, test taking time, etc. So experiment results. So table 1 shows that the squared in red, the treatment effect reduced total score by around 21%, holding other factors constant, which at a very high significance level. And then table 2 kind of further shows that being in the treatment group had a negatively and statistically significant effect not only overall, but also in section 1, so during the AI segment. So that shows that, being in that section, knowing that you're being analyzed generally led to worse performance. And the gender fixed effects were not statistically significant. Table 3 kind of, again, reiterates that the treatment performed worse overall. As you can see, like overall performance, 67% versus 76%. And within the treatment group, they actually improved their performance by about 12% when they exited section 1, which was the AI segment. And then table 4 shows that there's a difference of 12% in male participants over females, which I argue is not too bad. And because I onboarded students anonymously and randomously, I had no real control over that. But what is something to, keep in mind, and I would definitely say is a limitation of this study, is that the treatment had a much higher percentage of late night submissions. And so essentially, if your group performed worse, and within that group, more people took it late at night, that could have just exacerbated the poor performance. And then lastly, the MorphCast, so the AI output. It shows the average for group 1, so the treatment group, in section 1, which is the AI segment of their exam. And essentially, these two show an overwhelmingly negative kind of like emotional base that was detected. Specifically, the model claims that on average, students were about 45% worried or uncomfortable, 35% frustrated, distressed or nervous, 12% pensive or contemplative, and finally 8% determined or excited. So mostly negative. So I kind of alluded to it, but there definitely are some limitations to this study. Would I, try to build on top of it? I should have treated some participants in section 1 and some in section 2 just to ensure that there weren't like one-off questions that just were bad and just threw off everyone. I should have recorded both test sections and the control group so that data analysis is just even that much more certain. I should have gathered more information, like personal information, so age, major, class year, and added that to the fixed effects. And lastly, I should have definitely enforced a strict time, so everyone, let's say, takes it at 10 a.m., so that you don't have that factor of, oh, someone took it at 2 a.m., and surprisingly, they got a 40%. So takeaways, this study generally demonstrates the Hawthorne effect, which if you haven't learned or heard about it yet, you definitely will this year. It's generally the idea that knowing that you're being analyzed alters your behavior and performance. And so at large, I guess, policy implications, I would argue that as AI regulation gets pushed on and these models get that much more impressive and capable, I think AI policy should enforce guardrails, not only just on AI in general, but specific to like use cases. So HR is a specific use case. And developers should adhere to these requirements. And that way, the safety of users is really prioritized, because I would argue, besides the employees, who else is really going to fight for you in terms of just AI safety? Arguably, executives just want to make their model, they want to eat the world and make the biggest and greatest model. So that's my opinion. And I guess general advice, obvious stuff, start early. I took a lot of advantage of, from my advisor and her assistant. So I scheduled out like literally 2 months in advance. I went week by week and had a Calendly date set up. So I met a lot. I also took advantage of Oscar's office hours, which were incredibly helpful as well. So you guys got this. Good luck. Thanks for listening.